The day had begun like any other, with people from all walks of life heading to the airport for their flights. A packed terminal was filled with the sounds of rolling suitcases, announcements over the speakers, and the buzz of conversations. Among the crowd, a woman in her mid-40s stood out. She was dressed in an expensive designer outfit, and her appearance screamed wealth. Her every movement seemed to demand attention. She walked through the terminal with a sense of entitlement, head high, eyes sharp and focused on the world around her. She was used to getting what she wanted without question. She reached the check-in counter and looked impatiently at the staff member behind it, tapping her fingers on the marble surface. The woman's eyes darted around, scanning the other passengers. She wasn't concerned with them, though. To her, they were just a blur of ordinary people. She spoke sharply to the check-in clerk, demanding to know why her seat wasn't upgraded to first class despite her status with the airline. The clerk, looking nervous, apologized and quickly corrected the error, making sure she had a seat in first class. With a smug smile, the woman walked to security, cutting in front of a few passengers as though they weren't even there. She didn't seem to notice the annoyed looks she received. The flight attendants greeted her as she boarded the plane, treating her with a certain level of deference that seemed to please her. As she made her way down the aisle, her eyes scanned the cabin, settling on a seat in the front row where she could settle into her comfort zone. A black man in his early 30s was already sitting in that row, flipping through a book. He was dressed casually, comfortable clothes and a pair of dark sunglasses resting on the bridge of his nose. His face was calm, unbothered by the noise around him. He didn't seem to care much for the attention others were giving to the woman in the designer clothes, but as she approached, he could feel her eyes on him. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was a packed flight, and everyone was trying to find their seat. But then the woman spoke. "You're in my seat," she said, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Her tone was demanding and filled with expectation. The man looked up from his book, briefly glancing at the seat number. He realized she had made a mistake. His seat was a few rows behind hers, not in first class. "I'm sorry, I think you're mistaken," he replied calmly, pointing to the seat number on his boarding pass. For a moment, the woman looked surprised. Then she quickly regained her composure, raising an eyebrow. "I'm sure you're not supposed to be here," she said, clearly undeterred. "This is first class. What's someone like you doing up here?" The man's expression didn't change. He wasn't offended. He was just confused. He had dealt with far worse in his life, and this wasn't going to rattle him. "I'm just traveling like everyone else," he said evenly. "This is my seat, and I have a boarding pass to prove it." The woman didn't seem to hear him. She simply stared at him with a look of superiority, her lips curling into a slight smirk. "Well, I've been flying with this airline for years," she said, as though that made her opinion more important. "And I know how things work around here. I'm not sure what kind of deal you got, but it's clear you don't belong here." She was openly insulting him now, and the few nearby passengers were starting to take notice. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances, not sure how to react. Others, like the flight attendants, tried to keep their distance. But the woman's behavior was drawing attention. The man paused for a second, weighing whether to engage with her further. But as he glanced at the flight attendants, he saw one of them approaching. She had clearly noticed the growing tension and wanted to diffuse the situation before it escalated. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said with a smile. "Can I help you with something?" The woman, still holding her ground, turned to the attendant with a huff. "Yes, I think you can," she said. "This man is in my seat. I need to be moved to a more comfortable one." The attendant, clearly trying to remain calm, glanced at the woman's boarding pass and then at the man's. "Actually, ma'am, it appears this is his seat," she said gently, trying to keep the situation polite. "Perhaps there's been some confusion." The woman's face flushed with frustration. "There is no confusion," she snapped. "I've paid for first class, and someone like him should never be sitting here. I demand to be moved immediately." Her voice was growing louder, and the tension in the cabin was becoming palpable. The man shifted in his seat, slightly uncomfortable, but still keeping his calm. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, but he wasn't going to let her see how much it bothered him. He wasn't going to let her draw him into a confrontation. The flight attendant took a deep breath. "Ma'am, if you'd like, I can assist you with any seating issues when we reach cruising altitude. Right now, we need to get everyone seated before takeoff." The woman stared at the attendant for a moment, her face still red with irritation. She clearly didn't like being told no. "Fine," she muttered, But don't think I'm going to forget this. As she walked toward the front of the plane, she continued to grumble under her breath, but her attitude remained unwavering. She didn't seem to notice that her behavior had begun to rub others the wrong way. The man settled back into his seat, trying to block out her murmurs, his mind still on his book. However, the woman was far from finished with her theatrics. Once seated, she began to complain to the person sitting next to her in a voice that was just loud enough for people around her to hear. "I don't know why people think they can just take advantage of the system," she said, shaking her head. "He doesn't even belong here. I mean, come on, look at him. It's unbelievable." Her voice, dripping with disdain, was meant to be heard, and the people around her began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some of them looked away, not wanting to get involved, while others stole quick glances at the man. He, however, remained silent, pretending to ignore her. For a while, it seemed like the incident might pass. But the woman wasn't finished. She shifted in her seat and adjusted her sunglasses, clearly trying to make herself more comfortable as the flight began. But the discomfort in the cabin only seemed to grow as the woman's comments continued. She started making more pointed remarks, louder this time, clearly meant for the man to hear. "First class is for people who matter," she said, almost as if she were talking to herself but loud enough to make sure others overheard. "I can't believe they let people like him sit up here. It just doesn't feel right." A few people shot the man sympathetic glances, but no one had the courage to speak up. The man, feeling the weight of the stairs, kept his eyes on his book, hoping the flight would pass quickly. He didn't want to be the center of attention, and certainly didn't want to make a scene. But the woman's tirade continued, growing more audacious as the minutes went by. And as the plane soared into the sky, the woman's voice became more shrill, accusing the man of all sorts of things, each more absurd than the last. But her target remained unmoved, unshaken by the noise around him. He had learned long ago not to let others define him. What he didn't know yet, though, was that this encounter would become far more than just a chance meeting on a plane. The woman's words were about to unravel a mystery that would leave her embarrassed and shocked by the man's true identity. But for now, she continued her tirade, blissfully unaware that her actions would soon have consequences far beyond what she could have imagined. The plane was crowded, the kind of busy flight where every seat felt like it had been claimed long before the passengers arrived. The man found his seat near the middle of the plane, placed his bag overhead and settled in, adjusting his headphones and preparing for the long journey ahead. He was calm, reading a book quietly, not paying much attention to the surrounding passengers. Little did he know, a storm was about to form just a few rows away. The woman sitting across the aisle from him had boarded late, moving quickly through the cabin with a sense of urgency that bordered on impatience. She scanned the seats with a sharp gaze as if she owned the plane. When she spotted him, she immediately frowned. Something about him in her eyes seemed to have invaded the perfect order she had imagined for her trip. She tapped her foot, frowning, and muttered under her breath. At first, the man didn't notice. He continued reading, turning a page with calm focus. But her muttering grew louder, and she finally snapped, directing her words at him. "Excuse me, I think you're in my space. Could you move over?" she demanded, pointing vaguely at the area beside him. The man looked up, startled by the sudden hostility. He paused for a moment, then smiled politely. "I'm in my assigned seat, ma'am. This is where my ticket says I should be." He spoke gently, trying not to escalate the situation. Her eyes narrowed. "Oh, please, it's just a little space. Don't be difficult. Everyone can move a little. I just need my comfort." Her voice was loud enough that nearby passengers began glancing over, sensing tension. He nodded calmly, adjusting his position slightly to accommodate her, though he remained in his own seat. "I understand, ma'am, but I have to stay here. It's my seat and I'm not trying to cause any trouble." His tone was patient, almost soothing, but it did nothing to calm her. She huffed, shaking her head as if the universe itself had conspired against her comfort. "Unbelievable. You people are always making things difficult. Can't you just be polite for once?" she snapped, her words dripping with disdain. Other passengers began to whisper among themselves, feeling the tension but unsure how to react. The man remained composed, focusing on his book, hoping she would tire herself out and leave him alone. But she wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes blazing with entitlement. "Do you even know how to act in public? You're so rude." she exclaimed, her voice rising with each word. The flight attendants had noticed the escalating conflict and approached, trying to mediate. "Is everything okay here, ma'am?" "Sir?" one asked gently. The man looked up and nodded, explaining calmly that he was simply sitting in his assigned seat. The woman waved her hands dismissively. "No, he's being unreasonable. I've been traveling for years and I know what proper behavior is. He's disturbing my peace." Her tone was sharp, condescending, and it only drew more attention from passengers. The man took a deep breath, still maintaining his composure. "I'm not trying to disturb anyone, ma'am. I'm just trying to follow the rules and stay in my seat. That's all." His voice was steady even though he felt the weight of the woman's hostility pressing down on him. Other passengers began to shift in their seats, some giving disapproving looks to the woman, while others whispered to each other about the situation. The woman seemed oblivious to the stares, continuing her verbal attack. She accused him of being inconsiderate, questioning why he was sitting there in the first place, and speculating loudly about his character, all based on assumptions about who he was. The man didn't respond to the insults. Instead, he remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. His calm demeanor only seemed to frustrate her further, and she started escalating her complaints, calling for a supervisor and demanding to speak to the captain. She painted herself as a victim of an outrageous act of disrespect, while he quietly stayed in his seat, refusing to be baited. The flight attendants tried again, speaking in measured tones. "Ma'am, please, there's no need for confrontation. He's simply in his assigned seat. Perhaps we can find a way to make you more comfortable without causing a scene." But she was relentless, insisting that he should move, questioning his ticket, and even suggesting that he should be removed from the flight. Passengers were now fully engaged, some trying to offer support to the man, while others were uncomfortable and hoping the conflict would end. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted from ordinary travel to a tense scene of confrontation. The man's patience was remarkable. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't make threats, he didn't lash out. He simply remained in his seat, showing dignity in the face of public humiliation. The woman, frustrated that he would not respond with anger, became even more aggressive. She accused him of lying about his ticket, questioned why he was sitting among them, and made assumptions that revealed her prejudice. Each word was meant to belittle him, to make him feel small in front of strangers. The man, however, held his ground. He understood that reacting angrily would only escalate the situation, and he wanted to maintain his integrity. His calmness seemed almost surreal to the other passengers. They could sense that he was far more composed than the woman, and they began to quietly admire his restraint. Despite the tension, he tried to engage politely once, suggesting a small compromise, but the woman waved him off. "No, I won't compromise. You should just know your place," she snapped, her words cutting and sharp. It was clear she was not interested in civility. She wanted to dominate the situation and make him feel powerless. As the plane continued to board and the final preparations for takeoff were underway, the conflict did not abate. The man remained seated, reading occasionally glancing at the woman with a calm, unshakable demeanor. He did not retaliate even when she made the most pointed insults, mocking him in ways that would have rattled anyone else. Other passengers began to whisper to each other, expressing disbelief at the scene. Some were appalled at the woman's behavior, others impressed by the man's restraint. There were murmurs of support for him, quiet comments about how calmly he handled the situation, and shared looks that conveyed silent solidarity. Meanwhile, the woman seemed to sense that she was losing her audience. Her attempts to humiliate him in front of the crowd were not having the desired effect. Instead, she was increasingly the center of disapproval, though she remained oblivious. She continued to rant, determined to assert herself as the authority in the situation. The flight attendants were now actively monitoring the scenario, ensuring that safety and decorum were maintained. They had to keep the woman from causing further disruption, and they needed to make sure that the man was not unfairly pressured. They spoke to both parties with a calm professionalism, trying to de-escalate without taking sides. Finally, as the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension reached a peak. The woman had made her point to herself but had failed to intimidate the man. He remained seated, composed, and unaffected by her attacks. The passengers had witnessed the contrast between entitlement and dignity, prejudice and patience, humiliation, and self-control. Even after the engines roared to life and the plane lifted into the sky, the woman continued her muttering, clearly dissatisfied and angry. But the man remained calm, reading quietly, a picture of serenity amid the storm of her aggression. His quiet strength was not lost on the passengers around him, many of whom reflected on what they had just witnessed. They realized that this man, despite facing public humiliation, had not lost his composure, had not let anger control him, and had carried himself with dignity. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the incident had begun to settle. The woman, exhausted from her own outrage, finally sat back, though still muttering complaints. The man, unshaken, returned to his book, his calm presence offering a subtle lesson to everyone watching. That character is revealed not in comfort, but in the way one handles adversity, disrespect, and prejudice. As the flight continued, the whispers among passengers slowly shifted from gossip about the confrontation to admiration for his restraint. Some even discreetly offered apologies or words of encouragement, acknowledging the unfairness of what he had endured. It became clear that the woman's attempts to shame him had failed, and her behavior was quietly condemned by everyone who had witnessed it. The man's quiet dignity set the tone for the rest of the flight. He did not boast, he did not seek revenge, and he did not dwell on the humiliation. Instead, he focused on the simple act of traveling, showing through his calm and respectful behavior that true strength lies in patience and integrity. The incident became a quiet lesson for all on the plane about respect, assumptions, and the power of self-control. Despite the humiliation, he remained unbroken, an example of how to rise above cruelty without responding in kind. The plane had been in the air for some time now, and the atmosphere, though slightly calmer, still carried a tension that could be felt in the small interactions among the passengers. The woman, frustrated by her inability to dominate the situation, had retreated slightly into herself, but her glances toward the man remained sharp and judgmental. She had not finished making her point, and her mind was filled with indignation, convinced that she had been wronged. The man, on the other hand, continued to read quietly, occasionally glancing up to observe his surroundings. He had noticed the stares, the whispers, the subtle nods of support from strangers who could sense the injustice of the situation. Despite the hostility directed at him, he maintained a calm composure that seemed almost deliberate, a silent assertion of dignity in the face of unnecessary humiliation. As the flight attendants moved down the aisle with drinks and snacks, the woman's frustration began to manifest in more vocal complaints. "This is outrageous," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I should not have to endure this. People these days have no manners. It's disrespectful." She gestured toward the man, though he remained quietly in his seat, focused on his book. The man took a deep breath, closing his book for a moment. He did not raise his voice, nor did he respond with anger. Instead, he spoke gently, almost as if trying to reason with someone who could not see reason. "Ma'am, I am only sitting in my assigned seat. I am not trying to inconvenience anyone. If you are uncomfortable, perhaps the flight attendants can help find a solution that works for both of us." His words were calm, even and measured, and yet they seemed to only fuel her determination to assert herself. The woman's eyes narrowed. "A solution? What kind of solution can there be? You're the problem, not me. Can't you just move? Why is this so hard for you to understand?" She leaned closer, her tone sharper now, almost accusing. The other passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the escalating tension. Some looked away, unwilling to be drawn into the confrontation, while others watched intently, curious to see how it would unfold. One of the flight attendants approached again, speaking in a calm, professional tone. "Ma'am, please, there's no need to escalate this further. He is in his seat legally. Perhaps if we look at other options, we can make this comfortable for you." But the woman was relentless. She waved the suggestion off and continued to insist that the man move, ignoring the polite intervention and speaking louder with each word. The man, still calm, tried one more time to de-escalate verbally. "I understand that you are frustrated, and I am not trying to make your journey difficult. Please, let's try to remain calm so that everyone can travel safely and comfortably." His voice was steady and kind, but she dismissed it completely, continuing her verbal tirade. Other passengers began to whisper to one another, quietly expressing disbelief at the scene. Many were appalled at the woman's behavior, Yet impressed by the man's restraint, some offered subtle nods of encouragement, recognizing the courage it took to remain composed under such direct attack. It became clear that while the woman tried to assert dominance through loudness and aggression, the man's quiet dignity had begun to command the respect of the cabin. Time seemed to stretch as the woman's complaints grew increasingly personal. She began questioning his character, making assumptions based solely on his appearance and ignoring the calm evidence of his behavior. Her words became sharper, designed to humiliate and provoke, yet he continued to respond with patience, never letting anger take control. At one point, the woman escalated further, calling for the attention of the captain. "I demand you handle this. This is unacceptable," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. The flight attendants, trained to manage such conflicts, intervened swiftly, explaining that the captain would be informed if necessary, but that the man was simply sitting in his assigned seat. Their professionalism prevented the situation from spiraling out of control, but it could not erase the sense of discomfort among the passengers. Despite the woman's continued efforts to provoke a reaction, the man remained composed. He returned to his book, occasionally glancing up to ensure the situation did not escalate further. The passengers began to sense a shift. Her attempts to humiliate him were losing power, while his calm composure was quietly commanding attention. They saw that real strength was not in shouting or asserting dominance, but in maintaining integrity and patience. As the flight progressed, the woman grew more desperate. She tried to involve other passengers, hoping someone would support her point of view. Most avoided involvement, sensing that the situation was not as simple as she portrayed. A few whispered comments in support of the man could be heard, and one or two even gently questioned her behavior. This only seemed to frustrate her more, but she continued, determined to make herself the center of attention. The man noticed the whispers, the subtle signs of support, but he did not let them distract him. He understood that the situation could not be solved by force or argument, only by calm presence and reason. He continued to read quietly, occasionally responding with polite words when necessary, never raising his voice or showing irritation. Around him, the cabin began to settle into a tense rhythm. Passengers shifted in their seats, some glancing nervously at the woman, others quietly observing the man. The contrast between the two was stark, one fueled by entitlement and anger, the other by patience and dignity. It became clear to many that the real lesson of the encounter was unfolding before their eyes. As hours passed, the woman's energy began to wane. She had shouted, complained, and attempted to provoke the man, but he remained unaffected. Her face showed signs of frustration and fatigue, while he appeared almost untouched by the ordeal, calm and composed. The passengers began to quietly admire him, and the atmosphere shifted slightly, with more people acknowledging his restraint. The flight attendants continued to monitor the situation, ensuring safety and decorum. They discreetly moved the woman away when possible, offering reassurances to the man. He remained gracious, never showing any signs of resentment. His calm and patient approach had begun to influence the cabin subtly, and even the woman seemed to be tiring. Her words less sharp, her energy diminished. Eventually, the conversation between the two became less intense, though the tension lingered. The man's quiet presence had turned the confrontation into a lesson in patience and self-control, a demonstration that dignity and respect often speak louder than words or anger. The passengers around him began to see the incident not as a simple conflict, but as a display of character in the face of prejudice and entitlement. As the flight continued toward its destination, the woman seemed to realize that she was no longer in control. Her attempts to humiliate the man had failed, and the attention of the cabin had subtly shifted. The whispers and glances that had once supported her were now acknowledging him. The man's composure, calm demeanor, and polite responses had transformed him into an example of strength and patience. The hours passed slowly, but the man never wavered. He remained seated, reading quietly, speaking politely when necessary, and maintaining a level of respect that contrasted sharply with the woman's aggression. His quiet dignity became a subtle lesson for the passengers around him, a reminder of the importance of patience, integrity, and self-control in the face of provocation. By the time the plane began its descent, the woman had mostly given up. She muttered complaints quietly, no longer attempting to dominate the cabin or humiliate the man. The passengers, meanwhile, reflected on what they had witnessed. They saw that the man had faced humiliation and aggression without losing his composure, turning a hostile encounter into a quiet demonstration of character. The man's calm and patience had not only preserved his own dignity, but had also influenced the cabin. Passengers were quietly discussing what had happened, noting how he had handled the situation without anger or retaliation. His approach had shown that true strength is not about asserting dominance, but about maintaining integrity and respect, even when confronted with unjust hostility. As the plane touched down, the tension had eased. The passengers prepared to disembark, still reflecting on the events of the flight. The woman, exhausted and frustrated, realized that her attempts to humiliate the man had not succeeded. The man, still calm and composed, gathered his belongings, ready to continue his journey with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the ordeal. The incident on the plane became a quiet story among the passengers, a reminder that humility, patience, and self-control often leave a stronger impression than anger or entitlement. The man's ability to remain composed in the face of humiliation had turned a tense and uncomfortable situation into a lesson in character, one that would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The plane landed smoothly, the wheels touching the runway with a gentle thud. Passengers began to gather their belongings, stretching after the long flight, many still reflecting on the tense encounter that had taken place. The woman, exhausted and frustrated, muttered to herself, clearly irritated that the situation had not ended in her favor. She had expected a display of obedience, but what she got instead was calm dignity. The man remained seated for a moment, letting the other passengers move ahead, his demeanor still calm and composed. His actions throughout the flight had been quiet but powerful, a stark contrast to the woman's aggressive behavior. People around him exchanged glances, many of them impressed with how he had handled himself, recognizing the patience and restraint it took to remain unshaken under public humiliation. As the passengers filed off the plane, whispers began to circulate. Those who had witnessed the confrontation spoke in low tones, sharing their astonishment at his calmness. Some expressed support, while others commented on the woman's relentless behavior. The conversation shifted from gossip about the fight to admiration for the man's composure, and a sense of justice began to ripple through the cabin. Once off the plane, the flight attendants debriefed quietly, making sure everything had been handled appropriately. A few passengers approached the man discreetly, offering words of encouragement and expressing their respect for how he had remained composed. He smiled politely, graciously accepting their compliments without making a big deal of it, understanding that humility was as important as resilience. The woman, meanwhile, had been confronted by a few passengers who had overheard her complaints. Their polite but firm words made it clear that her behavior had been inappropriate, and she appeared flustered, not used to being challenged. Her confidence had crumbled as she realized that her attempts to humiliate the man had not only failed, but had backfired, leaving her isolated and embarrassed. As they exited the terminal, the man's identity began to unfold in the whispers and glances of those who had observed the situation. He was not just an ordinary traveler as the woman had assumed. Some recognized him as a prominent figure, a highly respected CEO known for philanthropy, a well-regarded community leader, and a person admired for integrity and contributions to society. Others who did not immediately recognize him were informed quietly by fellow passengers, adding to the growing buzz. The revelation of his identity created a subtle shock among those who had witnessed the confrontation. The contrast between the assumptions made by the woman and the man's true accomplishments highlighted the unfairness and prejudice inherent in her actions. It became clear to everyone that her entitlement and hasty judgments had blinded her, while the man's patience and humility had silently demonstrated the strength of character she had failed to recognize. The woman's demeanor changed noticeably as whispers began to spread. Some passengers nodded in recognition toward the man, and she realized that her behavior had not gone unnoticed. Her anger, once dominant, now seemed misplaced. She muttered apologies under her breath, but the words rang hollow in the face of the quiet dignity and social recognition that surrounded him. The man, aware of the growing attention, remained composed, choosing not to make a scene. He understood that his behavior throughout the flight had spoken volumes, and he allowed the reactions of others to convey the lesson without his needing to intervene. His restraint and humility had become a powerful statement in themselves, showing that character is revealed not through anger or entitlement, but through calmness, patience, and integrity. As he walked through the terminal, some passengers approached him, shaking his hand or offering quiet words of praise. He accepted these gestures with a polite nod and a warm smile, acknowledging their support without drawing unnecessary attention. It became clear that the impact of his actions during the flight had reached beyond the moment, leaving a lasting impression on those who had observed. The woman, now realizing the gravity of her error, avoided direct confrontation. She had hoped to assert dominance and publicly humiliate him, but the situation had reversed entirely. The man's calm demeanor, combined with his unassuming identity, had turned the tables completely. Where she had expected submission and shame, she found quiet respect for him and subtle condemnation for her own behavior. Passengers began discussing the incident more openly, sharing their reflections and perspectives. Many noted how the man's patience had prevented the situation from escalating further, and how his composure had provided a silent lesson in dignity and self-control. The story of the flight spread quietly among those present, a tale of humility triumphing over entitlement and calm over aggression. The man's approach to the confrontation demonstrated an important truth. Real power lies not in shouting, commanding, or attempting to dominate, but in the ability to maintain composure and integrity under pressure. His behavior became a quiet inspiration to the people around him, reminding them that patience, empathy, and calm reasoning are far more impactful than aggression or loudness. Even as he left the airport, the echoes of the confrontation and its resolution followed. The passengers carried the story with them, sharing it with friends, family, and colleagues. The man's conduct became a talking point, not for the drama of the conflict itself, but for the strength, patience, and grace he displayed. It was a lesson in how dignity can transform even the most humiliating situations into opportunities for teaching and reflection. The woman, meanwhile, had to reconcile with the reality of her actions. Her assumptions, based on prejudice and entitlement, had not only been proven wrong but had also left her publicly embarrassed. She faced the social consequences of her behavior quietly, a stark contrast to the respect and admiration the man had garnered. The incident served as a mirror, reflecting the impact of arrogance and the importance of humility. Throughout the airport, whispers continued to circulate about the man's true identity and the events of the flight. People shared their surprise, admiration, and reflections, creating a quiet but powerful narrative about integrity and strength. The man's ability to maintain calm in the face of provocation had left a lasting impression, reinforcing the idea that patience and dignity can outshine even the loudest aggression. In the end, the flight became more than just a journey from one place to another. It became a lesson in human behavior, empathy, and the consequences of judgment based on appearances. The man's quiet dignity and the woman's entitlement served as contrasting examples, illustrating the impact of our actions on those around us and the importance of responding to conflict with grace rather than anger. As the man continued on his way, the incident remained in the minds of those who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that true identity and character are revealed not through conflict or aggression, but through patience, composure, and integrity. The story of the flight, its confrontation, and the eventual revelation of his true identity became a symbol of how dignity and humility can triumph over prejudice and arrogance, leaving a lasting lesson for all who had been present. The man continued walking through the airport, his demeanor calm, composed, and unhurried. He moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, a presence that seemed to radiate dignity and strength. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation could not help but notice him, many of them offering subtle nods of acknowledgement or gentle smiles. The whispers about the flight and the events that had taken place were still circulating, and people continued to reflect on the man's restraint and patience. As he approached the baggage claim, he paused briefly to collect his luggage, taking care to handle it with calm efficiency. The terminal around him was filled with the usual clatter of travelers, rolling suitcases, announcements over the PA system, and the chatter of families and groups. Yet despite the bustling atmosphere, the story of the flight lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, and many were quietly observing him, still impressed by his composure. The woman who had caused so much tension during the flight had moved ahead of him, navigating the terminal with a visible sense of discomfort. She avoided eye contact and seemed aware of the attention she was drawing. Her attempts to dominate and humiliate him had failed, and the passengers who had observed the situation now seemed to regard her with quiet disapproval. She had realized, perhaps too late, the consequences of her entitlement and prejudice. The man, however, did not dwell on the incident. He remained focused on his journey, collecting his thoughts and moving forward. His approach to the confrontation had been deliberate, choosing patience and calm over anger or retaliation. He understood that responding to aggression with composure could turn a negative experience into a moment of silent teaching, and he had done so with grace. Passengers who had been particularly affected by the incident approached him discreetly. Some shook his hand while others offered words of admiration. "I don't know how you stayed so calm," one passenger said quietly, her voice filled with genuine respect. "I would have lost my temper immediately. You handled it beautifully." The man smiled politely, nodding, grateful for their words but not seeking attention. His humility only reinforced the impression of strength and dignity that he had displayed throughout the ordeal. The story of the flight began to spread beyond the airport. Passengers recounted the events to friends, family and colleagues, emphasizing the man's restraint, the woman's misplaced aggression, and the lessons in patience, dignity, and integrity that had emerged. The narrative shifted from a tale of conflict to one of admiration, with people recognizing the value of responding to hostility with calmness rather than escalation. As the man exited the terminal, he was met with a wave of sunlight and the cool air of the outside world. He paused briefly, taking a deep breath, savoring the moment of transition from the enclosed tension of the plane and terminal to the openness of the world beyond. He reflected on the events that had unfolded, understanding that the confrontation, while uncomfortable, had demonstrated an important truth. Character is revealed not in ease and comfort, but in the way one handles adversity. The woman, meanwhile, seemed increasingly aware of the reactions around her. Passengers who had once simply watched now acknowledged the man's conduct with subtle gestures, while the woman faced the silent weight of judgment. She had attempted to humiliate him, but the outcome had reversed entirely. Her assumptions, born of entitlement and prejudice, had failed, and the man's quiet composure had commanded the respect she had sought for herself. As the day progressed, the man continued on his journey. Moving through the city with calm purpose, he interacted with others politely, helping when needed and maintaining a demeanor of respect and humility. Passers-by who had heard of the flight's incident regarded him with admiration, seeing in his actions a model of grace under pressure. The story, though it began in the confined space of a plane, now had a life beyond it, serving as a lesson to anyone who encountered it. Throughout the day, he remained mindful of the impact of his behavior. He understood that calmness, patience, and dignity were contagious, influencing others even without words. The passengers on the flight had witnessed a moment of quiet power, a demonstration that responding to aggression with integrity leaves a stronger impression than any act of anger or retaliation could. The woman, now somewhat isolated, reflected on the events of the flight. Her assumptions and prejudices had led her to act aggressively, yet her behavior had backfired. The man's humility, combined with his true identity, had highlighted the injustice of her actions. She faced the reality of her mistakes quietly, a contrast to the public admiration and respect the man continued to receive. The encounter had become a reflection of how entitlement and prejudice can lead to embarrassment, while patience and dignity earn respect. As the evening settled in, the man returned home, carrying with him the lessons of the day. The flight incident had tested his patience and composure, but he had navigated it successfully, turning what could have been a humiliating experience into a moment of quiet teaching. He reflected on the significance of responding to hostility with calm and integrity, recognizing that such behavior not only preserves one's dignity, but also influences those around them positively. The story of the flight continued to circulate among the passengers and beyond, shared in conversations and recounted as a lesson in human behavior. People admired the man's restraint and humility, and the woman's failed attempts at domination became a cautionary tale. The narrative reinforced the value of patience, integrity, and respect in interactions with others. highlighting the impact of character over aggression. In the days that followed, the man's conduct became a source of quiet inspiration for many. The passengers who had witnessed the flight shared their reflections widely, emphasizing how he had handled a difficult situation without anger, how he had maintained composure under public scrutiny, and how his humility had turned a negative encounter into a lasting lesson in dignity. The woman, meanwhile, had to reconcile with the outcome of her actions. Her entitlement and aggressive behavior had been exposed, and she faced the social consequences of her actions. The contrast between her behavior and the man's patience highlighted the lesson that had emerged from the flight. Respect and composure in the face of adversity hold far greater power than aggression or attempts to humiliate others. The man continued with his life, quietly embodying the values he had demonstrated on the plane. He understood that his actions had made a difference, not through loud proclamations or confrontations, but through the simple, consistent demonstration of integrity and patience. The story of the flight became a quiet legend among those who had witnessed it, a tale of dignity triumphing over prejudice, humility prevailing over entitlement, and calmness influencing others more than aggression ever could. As time passed, the incident was remembered as more than just a confrontation on a plane. It became a lesson in human behavior, empathy, and the consequences of actions. The man's restraint and dignity served as a model for handling conflict with grace, while the woman's aggression and entitlement became an example of how assumptions and prejudice can lead to public embarrassment. The narrative continued to inspire, reminding people that the true measure of character lies in how one responds to challenges, insults, and adversity. Ultimately, the flight and its aftermath became a story about the power of patience, humility, and respect. The man's ability to navigate humiliation without losing composure left a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. His actions demonstrated that true strength is revealed not in anger or aggression, but in the quiet confidence of integrity, the patience to withstand provocation, and the humility to act with grace. The lesson endured long after the flight, a testament to the enduring power of dignity and character.